Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's CID Speaker Series. My name is Sarah Luttrell, and I'm the Communications and Events Manager at the Center for International Development at Harvard University. I look forward to today's discussion on the significance of feminist funding for development. The format for today's discussion is going to be a 15 to 20-minute presentation, and we'll leave the rest of the time for Q&A. So we hope that you'll come up with some great questions and be ready to ask the speaker anything that you might be interested in. But before we get started, I wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items. During the question and answer session, you can submit your questions directly in the chat or by using the raise your hand function. CID student ambassador and Harvard College student Miriam Garab will be moderating today's Q&A. We're also recording today's session, as you can see, and the video of this event will be on CID's YouTube channel. I'll also add links in the chat to sign up for CID's newsletter to find out about our research and events that are happening at CID. Our next speaker series is on Friday, November 12th. That's going to be at 12 p.m. Eastern Time with Seema Jayachandran, who's an economist and a professor of economics at Northwestern University. She'll be speaking on social norms as barriers to women's employment in developing countries. So we hope that you'll join us for that event as well. But without further ado, I would like to briefly introduce our speaker for today, Latanya Mapp Frett. Latanya is president and CEO of the Global Fund for Women. She formerly served as executive director of Planned Parenthood Global, which is the international arm of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. She also worked for 8 years as a human rights officer for the United Nations Children Fund, UNICEF, and for 10 years with the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. We're delighted to have her here with us today, and we thank all of you in the room. And Latanya, I'd like to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. What a pleasure to be here with all of you today, even if it is just black boxes. It's fine. So I always try to think about how and what might be of interest to the folks that I'm speaking to. So what I'll try to do is to just kind of go over some really core, I think, tenets around development and feminist funding, and then leave it up to the discussion. So again, it's just great to be able to talk about these things over and over again. And at the end, you'll see why, because I think repetitive sort of discussions around feminist funding is how we get to where we are in a journey, but also how we get to where we want to go. I'm calling in today from San Francisco, and this is where Global Fund for Women is based. But pre-COVID, I was a bit more bi-coastal, as I also teach. I'm adjunct at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. So I teach a course on repro justice, and I've done global health in the past. But I won't lean into any of that right now. I'll just talk sort of specifically about the work. But Sarah did mention that I worked in development for 20 years before joining an NGO, the academic and foundation sectors, right? So I started with, as she said, UNICEF in Southern Africa. I went on to work for them in East Africa and Asia as well, where I was able to see firsthand how multilateral partnerships with governments worked. And then I served in the U.S. Foreign Service with USAID, as she mentioned, and I worked there with tours in Botswana, Congo, Mali, Iraq, Nigeria, and Egypt. So I got kind of like a really good experience around the work, excuse me, that the U.S. Foreign Diplomatic Corps was doing. And as I mentioned, I have a strong background in sexual and reproductive health and rights and repro justice. It just seems like when women move forward a few steps that the politics around our bodies and choices heat up again. And while no one would tag me as a conspiracist, I don't think it's a coincidence any longer. I think it's correlated. But in any case, let's take a little time to talk about feminist funding, the support to social movements, and how we show up in the international development community. And again, like I said, I'll try to lean less into lecture and more time for discussion. So I'm going to just jump right in. So what do we know? From the green wave to the #EndSARS movements drive social transformation, but they also lack significant resources and support. We also know that feminist funds are changing that, not just in the moment, but for almost the last 4 decades. And I'll talk about that. So what I think feminist funding does is it upends the development model by providing flexible funding straight to local grassroots leaders and groups to use as they wish. And we're hearing more and more about this, right? It's getting very popular. But instead of dictating priorities, feminist funds follows grantees' leadership, supporting them in addressing needs, opportunities, and challenges as they arise on their own terms. Sometimes bilateralism, multilaterals, and especially traditional philanthropy can resemble the old boys club, right? And for those of you that like statistics, let's talk a little bit about funding gaps in women's movements. So only 0.42%, yes, that's like less than half of 1%, of all foundation grants are dedicated to women's rights, despite all the rhetoric that we've been hearing. And only 1% of gender equality funding gets to grassroots women's organization. And then let's overlay that with giving to women of color, which makes up only 0.5% of the $66.9 billion that is annually given to foundations, given from foundations. And that's according to the Miss Foundation study that came out not too long ago. So even within the small pie of gender equality funding, grassroots feminist groups are getting very little funding. And feminist funders try to take a different approach. We try to think less top-down decision-making, exploitation, and what we call poverty porn. And we try to think more of solidarity, trust, and building of collective power. And why is all of this important? I think I read, like maybe many of you, about this concept around solutions privilege recently. And this is the privilege of expecting easy and instant, and the new buzzword, of course, innovative solutions that would align with one's worldview, but doesn't challenge one's privilege. It's characterized by it's characterized by not really having community representation or diverse leadership at the table when you're coming up with these solutions. So when this happens in institutions, it could lead to solutions that develop at headquarters that don't work in practice in communities. And we all know some examples of these. I mean, solutions built in New York and London, et cetera, that have no relevance to the problems that are meant to address issues, let's say in Kampala or Porto Alegre, Brazil. Conversely, when money goes directly to the grassroots marginalized communities, they can create the change they seek. And so Global Fund for Women believes that transformation on sustainable social change comes from agendas and movements that are led by those that are most impacted and marginalized. So we work at Global Fund for Women in 6 regions, 175 countries, and we have over 7,000 grantee and resource partners. So it's a quite large feminist fund. But let's just focus on Africa for the sake of time. We have funded over 1,000 grassroots feminist groups on the continent, including, I hope some of you know, Akili Dada, which works with young women and girls on comprehensive sexual and reproductive health education in Kenya. Lima Gaboi's organization, the Women in Peace Network in Liberia. And if you want to talk more about that incredible story, we can do that. Also UHAI, which I hope many of you know, which is for Africa's first Indigenous activist fund for and by LGBTQI people, gender minorities, and sex workers, and the list goes on. I can tell you, I mean, we really are proud of and committed to funding bold gender justice movements to create meaningful change that will last beyond our lifetimes. And we have all these examples because we know that funding grassroots gender justice organizations creates this long-term change. And this kind of funding works specifically in a couple of ways: by funding local leaders, so we call them champions, to pursue the change they seek in the work they prioritize. And that funding has to be flexible. It has to be long-term, and it has to allow them to be able to spend on overhead. And for those of you that don't know, so many of bilateral, multilateral, and foundation, especially large foundation funds, do not allow that. And so that's why it's important that we have that at our organization, so they can adapt, so the organizations can adapt and respond to opportunities or crises. And this is how you begin to shift power. So change driven by grassroots people power becomes sustained progress. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. COVID has been a great example of how impactful this approach can be. Our grantee partners were able to turn to COVID relief almost instantly in their communities. And it was in a more effective and holistic way than we could have ever prescribed here sitting in our houses in San Francisco or New York or London, where a lot of our staff are. Because our funding is not restricted to specific programs, they were able to quickly apply it to COVID needs. So for instance, we support garment workers in Asia organizing against gender-based violence. They quickly started using their grant funds for immediate community needs when COVID hit. They started to provide food and basic PPEs to laid off garment workers, which, if you remember, was extreme in Sutton for many women who were now no longer able to achieve income. Another example is Women for a Change in Cameroon, which quickly started purchasing internet data for adolescent girls so that they can keep their schooling going and participate in global convenings like the UN Generation Equality meetings. And if you remember, so many schools, I mean, not just ours here in the US, but all over the world, had to close. And we saw a huge hit on girls not being able to continue their education for so many different reasons, whether they were cultural or financial, but because they were not able to have the resources required. And so we just look back on that email that we received from Cameroon saying that they wanted to use their money for internet data. We were like, okay, not even understanding what it meant and why they would turn to that so quickly. But they were ahead of the curve because they were in the community and they could see these things coming and happening. These locally led solutions are immediate, they're effective. And again, these are things that we wouldn't be able to do in the time that it's required to meet the needs. And let me just end by recognizing the next step in this journey from finding champions in their communities, which is sort of the process that I was talking about. You have to start with really talking about and talking to the people. So in our case, the women human rights defenders, the women who are the leaders, whether that's, politically, cultural, or financial in their communities, and talking to them about what they want to do, and then to supporting the growth of grassroots organizations. So in some ways, what we've attempted to do over the last few decades is to make sure that those champions have the capacity to build an organization around themselves. So it's not just one woman doing amazing things, but that woman then has an organization that can continue doing that work even after she's gone. And these organizations, as they focus on gender justice, we now see, if we want to look to transformational, which, the change that we all have been talking about, this systemic change, the systemic social change that we want to see, the systemic political, financial change that we want to see for women, that comes from movements that are led by those that are most, again, impacted and marginalized. And that's our new venture. And that means showing up for collective actors when they need you most and resourcing their efforts. We call it the movement-led approach. We believe it's not just who you fund, it's how you fund. For too long, much of philanthropy has been replicating the very dynamics it's trying to change in how it funds. It's top-down, it's from the north to the south, it's defined and directed by those with the power and the money. And at Global Fund for Women, we're saying our funding has always been flexible to our grantees, but you can't dictate how they use it. You have to listen to your partners. Our partners are leaders, not implementers. We're expanding this approach even further in our new movement-led approach. Our new strategy, since I've come in, focuses on this approach, which allows movements to determine their own needs. The movement-led approach shifts power and resources into the hands of the leaders of these organizations that are now acting in a collective manner. Most are in the global south, and they're impacted by the issues that they seek to address. Some of you may know Laurel Weldon, and she's done a lot of research on broad-based social movements. And she's been able to show the correlation that broad-based social movements are the most effective mechanism to create and sustain long-term social transformation. We are seeing this in action, from Black Lives Matter to the Green Wave movement. Movements are actually making this seismic shift in society, and I think we know that. And we are a donor and a recipient of funds, so we understand the dynamics. So we raise money to then provide money to organizations in the global south. So we see it from all angles. And one thing we do know is that trust is key from all sides. as is mutual learning. So we're constantly learning from each other. And that's the basis of the work that we do. And that is what really makes feminist funding different than most of the international development work that we've been seeing over, especially the last 4 decades. And so, we have an example with the Me Too movement. We're working with them. I don't know if some of you were able to see last week. They had their anniversary, and we joined them in a conversation around Me Too going global. We started a conversation with Me Too about 2 years ago when I got to Global Fund for Women. Most of you know that Me Too was a hashtag that started with Tarana Burks out of Brooklyn and really was focused on grassroots elimination of domestic violence and helping women to understand that they were not alone. And so, as you know, it grew far beyond the organization and its founder worldwide, but it also tended to sort of veer to grass tops. And we are working with Tarana and her team with her vision of a global community that centers survivor leadership through deep cross-country relationship building and practice sharing. And so together, Me Too, that movement, and Global Fund for Women have joined forces to support global movements around the world to end sexual violence. We want to provide funding and other resources to support this movement in becoming a well-resourced global ecosystem that works to end sexual and gender-based violence and make healing and actionable support systems available to survivors at the grassroots level. So we do know that feminists around the globe have been organizing around sexual and gender-based violence for many years, far before a hashtag, but yet they're often doing so without the benefit of connection and solidarity, and way too often on a shoestring budget. I mean, we think about what wins could be unlocked if organizers could be more easily sharing lessons and learnings and resources and information with each other, and that they can access better resources together to sustain this work. We did like a survey of close to 500 organizations that we fund working in sexual and gender-based violence. 99% of them indicated that they're interested in future engagement with the women, with the Me Too and Global Fund for Women relationship. So we know that we have power when we come together across geographies and learn from each other. And that's what this work is about. In the case of Me Too, it's about disrupting rape culture across borders, but we have so many examples of pilots of movements that we're trying to work in there. And, movements are local, right? So they start local. But what we feel like our niche is, and the space that we can bring, is bringing them together across geographies and learning from each other. And so that could be in any of, whether it's economic justice, climate justice is another one that we're working really hard on. We're working with groups in the Pacific, as well as groups in the Caribbean, which these are islands that we do know in 50 years will no longer be there. But what is the work that women are doing on the ground to mitigate some of that damage and to prepare for what is coming? And we want to make sure that we're able to support them. We hear from them. We know that it's challenging. We know that the work that they're doing doesn't get the kind of resources that they need, but we feel like we can help. And we can do that by listening to them and what their needs are, not by creating a program here that then we ask if they're able to participate. We want to do it the other way around. So let me just end, because I can go on about this, and would love to just talk to all of you about the funding, how it gets to grassroots feminist organizations, and how we can upend and change the way that we do it in the international development sector. And I think we can. I mean, we've been talking about feminist foreign policy, gender priorities, which includes a great deal of thought around development, international development, and how it gets delivered. So I will stop there and I will pass it over to our ambassador so that I can answer your questions.
Hi, Latanya, thank you so much. Actually, just to get the ball rolling with questions, my first question relates exactly to what you kind of finished off with. So for these large, international development organizations who have taken like this top-down approach in terms of not addressing the solutions on the ground and simply like looking for these like very quick like very quick fixes. What are the barriers?
Oh, shoot. I
Did
think
Miriam stick?
I think that she is stuck
Oh,
there.
okay, good. I thought it was
So,
me.
Yep. No, I think we're all having connectivity issues, but I think we did have one question in the chat. So maybe we can start off with
Turning off my
that.
video would
Oh.
help. Can you guys hear
Oh,
me better
yeah.
now?
Yeah, turn off your video and that's perfect. Yeah, if you want to continue asking your question, Miriam.
Okay, yes. So in essence, how can these large international development organizations who've taken like this top-down approach and simply like kind of throwing money at the issue for quick fixes, make that transition to a more to an approach more like what your organization has been doing, and like what are the challenges that they're going to face in that transition?
It's a good question, Miriam. I sit on the board, for example, with Oxfam. I also sit on the board with Management Sciences for Health. And so Management Sciences for Health is more of like what we might consider as a Beltway bandit. It is a nonprofit, not a for-profit, like many of them, like Chemonics and APT and others. But it's the reason why I mention this is because I watch both of them. Oxfam doesn't take US government money, so it's very different in the way it can show up with its partners. But I do see that there is a process of coming closer together. One of the things that, let's say with MSH, I'll use as an example, MSH has now started a for-profit in-country, it's in Kenya, organization that's called MedSource. And this was all ground up. So when I talk about started, it wasn't just started from Washington, DC. There was a group of employees of MSH, as well as some of its leadership from other sectors in the community, whether that was the hospital administration sector, the pharmaceutical sector, that talked about needing the buying power of a large organization. So let's just say Gavi, because that's a good example. Gavi is currently right now buying and or receiving gifts of a huge number of COVID vaccines. And their work has always been to get those vaccines to where they're needed. Basically their opportunities to partner with manufacturers means they get them at a great price, a price that one country alone, or certainly one hospital or community center, could never afford, right? So they get them at these great prices and then they're able to give them out. Well, if you think about that at the broader health system sector and how hospitals that are probably private, small hospitals, not even public, but even pharmacists, community-based pharmacists and clinics, small clinics, how can they afford both medical supplies and medicines, right? So what the thinking is, if we could have an opportunity to gain buying power by bringing all of these smaller players in the healthcare system together, smaller but important because they're community-based, right? If we could bring them together and do some purchasing together so that they don't have to buy these individual retail prices, that they can get it wholesale, then they will be able to actually afford to be able to service their clientels without prices that, of course, their community can't afford. And so it's called MedSource. It's a simple idea. We've seen it in international development for many years, but it's always been led, right, from the headquarters somewhere. So Gavi is in Geneva, MSH is it. So the thinking was to start something that's based, accredited, and run in Kenya. It is for profit for many different reasons, but it is driving the solution, and that solution is coming from the country. And so when I talk about what Global Fund, maybe everybody is not fit to be able to do what Global Fund does. It doesn't have the relationships. And quite frankly, most of the groups that we talk to, they don't even want government funding because of all of the the stuff that comes with that, all the insistence to do it this way, and God forbid the accounting and auditing and all of these things. But what they could do is think of ways to listen to what is required in the country and let the solution be led in the country. And I don't think that it's as big a leap as I feel like some people in development think it is. It is shifting the mindset to the way you do it. I remember when I was at both UNICEF and USAID spending long periods of time crafting strategies from the headquarters. And then once we did it, right, so we spend weeks in rooms and then months to put this thing together and make it sound great. And then we give it to the field, right? We'd be like, what do you think? Does this work for you? And then, people will come back, they'd have comments, but pretty much the whole thing had been crafted, right? And it had been crafted based on what we understood the needs to be, as opposed to letting it get crafted and developed where it was. And then we can get it and say, okay, now how do we support this thing, which should be our strategy. And that's certainly the strategy at Global Fund for Women. So I hope, that maybe is a long way to kind of get to what I think is not as difficult a journey to getting to where we want to go as I think some people see it. It does change the way we do development, but it's time to change the way we do development. I think of it this way, Miriam. I think of it as I have spent more than 25 years doing traditional development work. And a lot of that work has been because we were trying to build the capacity, whether it's a government agency or an NGO in that country. We've built that capacity. In some ways, it's like we succeeded. Now, how do we move to the next level? How do we move out of the way we were doing things, because we have all this capacity in the field now? You've seen it. It's like wonderful people running these organizations and governments. Why can't we just listen now and change how we show up? So that's how I think of it.
Thank you so much, Latanya. And I think Carrie has a question now.
Sure.
Hi, thank you so much. And I did actually put my question in the chat, but it's changed a little bit based on what you've said, because you've answered the original question, which is, has the Global Fund for Women considered providing resources in addition to, but aside from funding to these movements? And I think you've mentioned with the Me Too movement, you're also providing a network for locally led women's movements to come together and kind of share resources. And so are there other resources that the Global Fund for Women provides aside from networking and funding, or other things that movements have requested?
Yeah. So thank you, Carrie. And, one of the things that we've been really struck with over the last year, particularly during COVID, is this idea, which we renamed for UN Women, of feminist tech. And that is thinking about access. Access is a big part of it, but we want to kind of go beyond that, right? So we're talking about women having access, girls having access to hardware, right? But now we're like, okay, so yeah, it's the same kind of thing. We have to follow that journey, and it's very hard for big multilaterals and bilaterals to do this. But yes, access is absolutely important, and we have to put the hardware in the hands. They have to have phones so they can get on the internet. They have to have laptops and other things so they can do their work. But what about the architecture of the tech industry, right? What about all these things that are being developed in developing countries, or the global South, as we now call them, that are meeting the direct needs of their communities, right? It's kind of simple. What apps are being developed for you guys there in Boston, right, are not necessarily the same apps that need to be developed in Delhi for the women that are doing work there, because it just looks different, right? But they are being developed, but they're not being promoted. They're not being, again, resourced, financed. They're not getting angel funding to do this. And how can we shift that a little bit, again, with the same kind of, I would say, thinking, as we were just talking about with development and funding, how do we do that now to provide them support? How do we connect them to investors, or we'll call them angel investors? How do we connect them to technology companies, even within their countries, not to mention in their regions, and more global multinational companies? How do we get them at the table to start thinking about things like AI, and why AI is so male dominated, and how, when you create something as a man, the possibility that it may look different, and the responses that we get may look different, and not just our gender, but also, our race, our ethnicity, our geographies. Those are all very different. And so you have to have, in the development of the technology, women and differences and diversity at the table as it's produced. And so we have been very struck with, and we have now seeded what we call a Global South Feminist Tech Fund. It's based out of, I believe, Thailand right now. And its whole purpose is to now start giving out grants separately for the architecture of technology. So what we call feminist technology is not just the access piece, but it is how do we develop technology that speaks to some of the gender justice issues that we've all been fighting for, and the racial justice and climate justice, because they're all intersected issues, and how do we use technology to create social change that we've been going for. And so I bring that up because it is not just money. And for many of them, it's not just money. We could write a check, but then what do they do with that if they have no access to many of these, I'll just call them boardrooms where these things are being developed and pushed out. They need way more than that. And so we have now started talking to a number of countries, not just ourselves, but the entire, for many of you that knew the gender equality forums that happened with the UN this year started something which they call the action coalitions. And those action coalitions, and they're in different areas. So there's one in bodily autonomy, and then there's the one in feminist tech that I'm talking about. And it includes a cross section of NGOs, of foundations, of governments, and then of course, corporate sector people. And in ours, in our action coalition, we have a lot of the technology companies sitting in that group. And then we're sort of challenging them to provide access in ways that they haven't before, whether that is free software, free development classes, and this and that, so what we're trying to do is get them to think beyond just writing the check, which we could do through the fund that I talked about, but then how do you accompany that with all of the resources that developers, for instance, are going to need in order to push out the work that they need for social transformation. So that, that's just a small example. We do other stuff around communications and advocacy, lifting up voices. When I first came to Global Fund for Women, Hong Kong was, Hong Kong still is in a very challenging situation. But at that point in 2019, there were protests every day. They were organizing. There was a policy that was actually coming up in China, mainland China. And so we were trying to assist. We have a sister fund. We call them sister funds. We have seeded more than 49 sister funds around the world. And so Hong Kong has one. It's called the Her Fund. They have 6 people that run this organization to fund other grassroots women's organizations in mainland China and Hong Kong. And so I called and I said, hey, do you guys need any more resources? We can try to cut a crisis check for them, which is what we call it. They were like, yeah, no, we can't absorb any more money. We literally can't do any more than what we're doing. But what we do need is we need US politicians to speak up against what's happening here in Hong Kong. We need the major news channels to run stories about what's happening. And so that is like the way that we've been thinking about resources too, this amplification of what's happening in places and how we can get the major networks, how we can get better stories out there online, how we can cover. It took, and I know this because they counted, it took 6 weeks for there to be one protesting in Hong Kong. Every story was about.
Latanya, I think you might be jumpy a bit.
So, this is the kind of thing that we feel like it doesn't cost you anything to try to go and get more information into the news media to lift up this work. I'll stop there. Sorry. Yes.
Thanks, Latanya. So from the chat, how do you select grantees? Is there a follow-up throughout the process while it is community-led and flexible?
Thank you. So I'll talk about the journey because I think it's important to see how you have to be agile and how you have to continue to look to better meet the needs of the communities that you're working with. So we, like everybody else, used to have a process of we put out what we call an RFP. So like a call for proposals. all over the world. And of course, we quickly learned that the only people that actually were reading it were people that probably needed it less, or whoever had access to be able to see these kind of calls for proposals. And so we shifted, and our first shift was language, around language justice. And so we created a system of producing that same call for applications into the 5 major languages like of the UN, but then under that, we had contracts with women's organizations who were translating that into the local languages of their regions. So that was the big thing. We just wanted to be able to access more women, more champions, as we call them, by allowing them to see this call in their own language. So that was the first step. The second step, though, was we were realizing after talking to, and of course, this is why relationships are important, that people were like producing these long applications, and we'd get like thousands of them, and could only fund maybe in one fiscal year, maybe about 500, right? So you had about 2,000 who were actually, not able to do anything with that proposal. And because of their circumstances and their capacity, they may have spent like a month trying to put this thing together, and then they didn't get funding. And that doesn't help anyone. And so what we decided to do then was to change the way that we were doing it. So instead of asking people to fill out applications and proposals, we changed our website to now to say register with Global Fund for Women if you would like funding. And so very simple, name, address, what do you do, what's important to you. So it's just like a form, and it's very simple. And again, it used all of the languages that we talked about, and it also allowed them to write these things in their own languages. And we would translate it from our side. And so that changed the dynamic. So basically what we would do is we would go through all of the registered organizations, and we would, if we wanted an application from them, we would ask them to specifically write it. So let's say if we knew we could only fund 500 applications, we might only ask 600 to actually to send us an application. We have at the Global Fund for Women as well a network of advisors. So we have more than 300 women, many of them previously received funding from Global Fund for Women, but they have become advisors. And I don't want to say paid, because I think they get something like $500 a year, something tiny. And what they do for us is that we have now pushed it out of our headquarters where we look at these applications into the hand of the advisors. So if we get an application from Sudan, it is a Sudanese woman who is looking at that application, and she will actually go to the organization if she's close enough to visit them and talk through their application and make changes according to what that conversation looks like. So now it's a whole different dynamic than the way we started, right? So they registered, and we were like, that's exciting. We called the advisor in Sudan and said, this group looks exciting. Can you get in touch with them? What do you think? And she makes a recommendation. She talks to them if she wants the application to be better. And so our process has incredibly changed now, and this is the last part of it. We have also changed and shifted again to what we call movement-led work, and I talked a little bit about that in the beginning. And so what this means is that it's collective actors. And so if you are working on gender-based violence, we actually have a team of people from the Global South who are working on global-based violence themselves and receiving funding from us, but now they are looking at the applications and deciding as a collective unit who we should continue to fund, who are the new people to bring into that space, and how do we continue to grow and listen and learn from that work based on the actual funding that we put out now. So it's a lot different. So it's now a group of people who are in charge of doing that by geography and by theme, and they themselves are grantee partners.
Thanks, Latanya. And for our last question of the day, one from the chat, from Mong, it says, thank you, Latanya, for inspiring work and presentation. An Indigenous person from Nambia told me that we are tired of being developed. This sentiment reflects how international development projects often have limited local community involvement and identifying their own problems, and the development projects have limited or no specific plans for long-term capacity building with community members. So can you share how you engage local voice to identify issues and plans for capacity in community to continue after funding ends? Any specific example would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. No, you're welcome, and thank you for the question. I've talked a lot about how our interest in sort of changing that dynamic, and because in many ways, these communities are developed, but for some of the things that, quite frankly, colonialism and patriarchy and so many other challenges, to their own development has happened to try to in many ways halt that development. Because if you think about it, many of the groups that we have to work with do come from marginalized sections of their own societies, right? So it is that sort of segmentation that is important in the work that we do. Because even if you did, let's just say, Egypt is another country that I lived and served in. Even if we said we were doing quote unquote development programs in Egypt, as I saw, many of those programs, and Harvard is a good example. Harvard used to have a program through the Development Assistance Program at USAID in Egypt, where they would bring students to the US to study. A good deal of those programs did not include women. And I started just as an officer, heading up the program office there. I was like, every year we're talking about like 90% of the recipients of those scholarships that were paid for by the US government and students that were getting sent to Harvard were male. And it was hard for me to understand how that could be possible. And you go into it and you realize that because the whole selection committee, and I know this for sure, were all male. And so where if it was, a couple of these badass women in Egypt who have been doing some incredible things over the year, if any of them has sat at the table, then that would have been a different case. Because it wasn't that there weren't qualified women applying. It was just that they were using metrics that did not include gender parity and equality. And so some of what I'm trying to get at is that we have to realize these things are going to be hard for us to sit at Harvard and tell, right? We just got out of 100, 90 of them were men. Well, obviously that was how it worked out, right? But we have to understand that that is not how it just worked out. There is something going on at the country that we need to be able to understand. And so we can't run the program and make selections from Harvard. We have to let that happen in the country, and we have to make sure that the most marginalized in the country are also a part of making those selections happen. And that's just a sort of really small example, because I think that this shows up in big ways. But if you have work in Uganda and you don't include LGBTQI people in that work, then you can't really say that it's community led. You can't say that it's led from the country. And so what I'm seeing is that there is a shift happening. And I think to her question and her point, that many organizations, whether they're bilaterals, multilaterals, or foundations, are starting to see the value of ensuring that there is locally led input. But again, it can't just be that you develop something and then say to the Indigenous community, what do you think? Do you think you could do this? It has to be from them. And so I think that nuance is very important. Also, what you see a lot of is like, oh, we'll hire someone, so we'll hire, I just got off the phone yesterday on our Afghan work, which is, as you know, very trying right now. But, we're insisting, that we hear from the community. The people left, in the country, because so many of our colleagues have now gotten out and they're in other places. But, people are like, no, what we'll do, these are our funders, the funders who we get to then fund people in Afghanistan are like, no, I think what we'll do, we're going to hire an Afghanistan woman to run the fund from there, and it's like, and then she'll be able to ensure that we set up a strategy here that go, and again, it's like, well, I mean, she came out, and in this case, it was someone who came out like 15 years ago, and hadn't been back once since. And so I think we just have to be a little smarter, a little more trusting, and we have to build those relationships in country that will equate into programs that are relevant to the groups that we're trying to reach.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Latanya, and thank you, Miriam, for your navigation of the Q&A. But Latanya, that was a wonderful presentation, and a lot of the things that you've said have resonated with many of the conversations that we have at the Center for International Development at Harvard. Lots about relationship building and in-country work, and so lots to unpack there and to think about. And I look forward to seeing the future of the Global Fund for Women and more from you. And thank you all for joining and for your great questions. We hope that you will share this presentation with your friends and others who might be interested in the conversation. We're also recording a podcast after.
Okay.
With Latanya and one of our CID student ambassadors. So look out at the CID SoundCloud for that interview as well. And we hope that you'll join us for our next speaker series, which is on Friday, November 12th. And that's going to be with Seema Jayachandran, who again is an economist and professor of economics at Northwestern University, speaking on social norms as barriers to women's employment in developing countries. So we look forward to seeing you then. And thank you very much again, Latanya. And we will see you all soon.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you.